Hi there, my name is Daniel Maloney, and in the following presentation I'll be analysing the aquatic movement skill of a tumble turn from a front crawl stroke position. And I will do this by comparing myself with an Australian Olympic swimmer named Stephanie Rice. Based on the following footage, I've deemed myself to be at a pre-control level, whereas Stephanie is at a proficient level. In using this comparative analysis, I'm able to view the implications of my movements on my overall performance, which will allow me to create relevant learning activities designed to alter and improve my performance going forward. So, the aim of the tumble turn is to change the directions in a pool in the most efficient way that does not impede on the performance of the stroke, as shown by Stephanie Rice in the following footage. Performing the turn appropriately reduces the drag force through streamline while also utilising the wall to maintain and produce an equal amount of force upon entry to exit, aligning with Newton's third law of motion that every action has an equal and opposite reaction. The tumble turn as a skill can be broken down into 5 distinct stages. Each of these stages are dependent on the skill that preceded them, kind of like a domino effect. So let's look at the slow-mo to analyse. First, Stephanie's approach phase to the wall, into a rotation phase, then there's the wall contact phase, followed by a glide phase, and finally the stroke preparation phase. So as I started to compare my tumble turn with Stephanie's and playing the spot the difference game, I started to realise, well, the skill starts breaking down for me at the beginning, and that's my approach phase to the wall. According to Slawson et al., velocity is the key when it comes to the approach phase to the wall, and a swimmer should use their final 2 strokes to propel themselves forward in a streamlined position to engage in the rotation. It is evident that Stephanie does this really well. She uses her final 2 strokes to propel herself forward in a streamlined position, head first to the wall. Because I don't use my final 2 strokes to maintain speed, and my arms are flexed from my shoulder joint out in front of me with a bit of external rotation, I'm increasing my overall drag. Additionally, my hips are clearly dragging in the water because my center of mass is further a distance apart than my center of buoyancy is in comparison to someone like Stephanie. And what this is all doing is increasing my drag, reducing my velocity as I try to engage in the rotation, and making it a lot more difficult for me. So now that we've outlined the difference in speed and the influence this is having on our rotation, we need to look at what's happening anatomically that is allowing Steph to engage in the rotation in a much more efficient and effective way than myself. And well, it begins with an anterior pelvic tilt. We both do this, engage in this movement. However, Steph uses plantar flexion of the feet to propel herself with that final kick and begin her rotation, all in sequence. Her knee joint is completely extended with her legs straight and her arms by her side in a streamlined position. Me, on the other hand, my legs are bent with my knees and ankle joints both flexed as I try to pull my knees up into my chest, my ankles and heels going into my hamstrings as I enter a global flexion state. If you also look at my feet, they're dorsiflexed, offering me no propulsion into my turn, and that's where my hands and forearms are coming into play. They're supinated, and I'm trying to use them to rotate around, as you'll see in the following slides, the effect of this. No surprise, Steph's legs are still straight as she begins to flex at her shoulder joint to facilitate the streamlining and the balance through the turn. She stays on the transverse axes within the sagittal plane, importantly. So that means her head is over her torso and over her legs, directly in line with each other. The same clearly cannot be said for me as I start to rotate and shift off the transverse axes onto the longitudinal axes. And this is because of a few things. Starting off with, anatomically, my knees and ankles have been flexed for some time now, and this has changed where my center of mass is. It's causing my hips and glutes to drop down and sink into the water, combined with the lateral flexion of my head and the supination of my hands, flexion of my shoulders. I'm starting to rotate and shift onto the longitudinal axes, which is perpendicular to the transverse axes. Steph, on the other hand, is able to stay more buoyant than I am. As you can see in this photo, her legs are basically breaching the water. But she's manipulating her center of mass by flexing at the shoulders, keeping her legs straight, so that she stays higher up to the surface of the water, and this will obviously influence where her feet make contact with the wall. I thought it was of value to show this last freeze frame of Steph and myself because it further reiterates the dramatic difference in our rotation. Steph's staying once again on the same axis. Her vision is directly upward. My vision is towards the end of the pool. I'm flexed at my elbows, increasing my active drag. My head's up, also increasing my active drag. Whereas Steph's in a streamline. Her arms and upper body are in a streamline position. I think it's worth noting here that at a pre-control level, my environment is controlling me, whereas Steph has complete control over her environment at a proficient level. So I think for me, instinct starts to come in here, and being upside down in the water is pretty uncomfortable. So my body's doing everything it can to rotate around to returning to a comfortable state. So back to Steph here, and let's look at Newton's third law of motion in action. And that is that every action has an equal and opposite reaction. And then we'll compare it to mine. So Steph, once again, this big dolphin kick, she propelled herself forward at speed. Look at the legs, they push down, she kicks down, and that exerts force upward in an equal and opposite reaction. Importantly, here she extends both her knees and hips rapidly, causing that last little bit of rotation into the wall contact. This freeze frame shows Steph in contact with the wall with her knees bent at about 90 degrees, which Weimar et al. 2019 suggests is around the optimal degrees of flexion. Any more and you'll increase your time in contact with the wall, which will then reduce the impact of your stretch shortening reflex. So Steph is optimizing this, and she's doing this, as you can see with the green arrow, in a dorsiflexed position of a feet and ankle joint. Her knees and hips have just been extended, and they're about to go into a state of flexion as she concentrically contracts her gluteus maximus, quadriceps, gastrocnemius, and soleus all at once for a powerful push off the wall. Just going to show a different angle here to analyze my contact with the wall phase. And as stated earlier, because of the lack of speed I take into my approach, I perform movements that try to make up for that lack of speed. That enable me to rotate. So just like Steph's big dolphin kick, I use my arms in a downward motion, as you'll see here, shoulders flexed, supinated, hands and forearms, and my ankles, knees, hips, all flexed. I use my arms in a downward motion that pulls my head up, rotates my body over, and it causes me to over-rotate and sink. As you can see here, my feet are chasing contact with the wall, and my body is sinking down, and we'll quickly analyze the difference between where I'm making contact with the wall and where Steph is making contact with the wall. So looking at Steph and that 90-degree angle and how this is optimizing her stretch shortening cycle, which is a way of loading the muscles with these counter movements or pre-stretch actions to produce more force during the concentric phase. So right now, her quads, her gastrocnemius and soleus are eccentrically contracting. Her ankles dorsiflexed, with her Achilles tendon playing a big role in this as well. And it enables her to exert as much force against the wall as possible when she extends her hips and knees. Whereas me, my hips are already somewhat extended, as you can see in the difference of the angle of our knee flexion. My feet aren't completely in contact with the wall. Therefore, I'm not optimizing the pre-stretch phase of the entire contraction, whereas Steph clearly is. And you can just imagine this on land, jumping off the ground as high as you can, just on the balls of your feet, compared to making complete contact with your foot to the floor. You produce a much greater amount of force, and that's the difference between Steph and my contact with the wall. Also, the yellow arrow indicates how much lower my feet are against the wall, and not to mention the direction they're facing because of obviously my deviation off the transverse axes. And let's have a look at what this now is going to do to my glide phase and my exit out of the turn. So for reasons outlined, I'm pushing off the wall much deeper, and therefore the angle of my emergence is much greater than Steph's, increasing again my passive drag, slowing me down even further as I then enter into the stroke preparation phase. And here's a screenshot of that. I actually push off relatively straight in comparison to Steph, but because I'm so much deeper, and I do push off quite to go even further deeper, you will see that the angle is greater that I have to come up on. Around 45 degrees is what I've figured it out to be. And also, I'm not in a streamlined position. Steph has her biceps tucked to her ears, hand over hand, as she begins to glide into a prone position. The reason she does this during the glide phase is because it hinders her speed the least. It is most beneficial performance to do the rotation during a completely streamlined phase where she's optimizing the use of her dolphin kick to then emerge and begin her stroke preparation phase. Me, on the other hand, I'm already in a prone position because I rotated off the transverse axis much earlier in my tumble turn. And overall, this point now, my speed is completely reduced, where it's going to make it extremely difficult for me to now pick up my speed again once I begin my stroke. And that concludes the comparative analysis. And to summarize, basically every movement and action I've taken during my tumble turn has worked to reduce my speed, whereas Steph has done the opposite. So to begin with our activities, we need to start at the approach phase, because there's no point starting anywhere later if we can't get this part right. And according to Gentile's model of skill acquisition, the two objectives for the initial stage of learning are: 1, to learn the basic movement pattern, and 2, to identify environmental factors important to the task. So for that reason, we're focusing on the final 2 strokes of the approach phase, propelling myself forward, so increasing my thrust into a streamlined position, so reducing my drag, and stopping there, focusing on just that component of the entire skill. The reason I perform this skill at the shallow end aligns with Gentile's initial stage of skill acquisition, and that is that the learner needs to feel safe and in a familiar environment. It also reduces my cognitive load. I'm not really focused on staying buoyant. I'm not using all this effort to keep myself afloat and focusing on all other aspects of the skill. It allows me to narrow my focus and attention in on what is important in this activity. So I've slowed this video down to show where I'm progressing from for my first activity. And as you see, my left arm after my breath is the final stroke that propels me forward into the streamlined position. The progression is quite simple. It's changing from my left arm to then being my right arm. And this is more closely replicating Steph, as she doesn't breathe in her approach phase and she stays in a streamlined position. The next progression of this activity is to introduce my anterior pelvic tilt. So literally doing the exact same activity, just adding the next sequence, as you can see in this video here. The focus is to again stay in a streamlined position, keep my arms by my side and not bend the knees. Have the knees completely extended still and just focus on that anterior pelvic tilt. And the final progression of this activity was firstly to take it to the deep end, so that I need to start thinking about how I can manipulate my center of mass to stay as buoyant as possible, whilst also starting to think about my arms and getting my arms in a streamlined position. Whilst this was challenging, you can see where I'm developing, and I'm developing because of that approach phase, those final 2 strokes, and focusing in on streamlining my arms and body. And what it's doing is it's helping me stay on that transverse axis, keeping my body in line, and hopefully I can start making better contact with the wall, higher up on the wall, and my tumble turns will begin to improve. So I thought I'd finish today's presentation with where I'm at now with the tumble turn. It's been a pretty humbling experience, really, but those activities have actually put me in good stead so far. This is probably the best tumble turn I've done. And yeah, those activities have kind of just made me focusing on the right things, my approach, my rotation, and obviously still got a lot to work on with my wall contact and then the glide phase. But yeah, that's where I'm at now, and thanks for watching.